Tantor Audio presents The Bite in the Apple, a memoir of my life with Steve Jobs, by Chrisann Brennan, narrated by Coleen Marlo. Note to the listener. There are 3 things I never thought I would do in this life. Study history. History gives me migraines. Play the drums. I'm just not very good at it. And write a book. And here I am writing a note to the listener of my book. Over the years, a number of people have encouraged me to write my story, and many more have warned me off it, even going so far as to say that I didn't have the right. This right that they were talking about was the right to tell the story of my history with Steve Jobs. I met Steve when I was just 17. I became his first love and the mother of his first child, and as such, I have a unique perspective to share on this man who has fascinated the world. I've always been reluctant to share my story. For one thing, most of my time and attention has been devoted to my daughter, Lisa, and to my life and work as an artist. For another, my relationship with Steve was nuanced and difficult. I never wanted to revisit that history, much less go public about it. Never say never. In July of 2006, I became sick. Doctors were unable to diagnose the problem. I wasn't able to work. The fumes from my painting exasperated my illness. And within 5 months, I was virtually homeless. My illness slowed me down and left me bored and scared. So I found myself reaching for something meaningful on which to focus. I put my things into storage, packed up my car, and traveled around to the Bay Area, from Marin to Santa Cruz counties, staying with friends while trying to heal. I drove up to visit my father in Sacramento, and it was then, while I was alone in my car, that I had the first spark of an idea to write this book. The words came to me, "It's time." My circumstances were dire, and I can say now that nothing short of these dire circumstances would have led me to do the painstaking work of looking back into that history with Steve, much less writing about it. But as I had nothing left to lose, I began. Writing a memoir is a lot like spelunking. Headlamp on, I felt as if I were dropping down into deeper and darker caverns, negotiating vast and tight spaces to discover the great and terrible beauty that had been sustained in the cool, dark places under the surface. Once I started putting it all together, my only thought was to keep going. I found the process rich and revelatory. Revisiting the past and working to define my own place in it gave rise to life-altering insight and freedom. What I didn't know then is that it would take me nearly 7 years to write my memoir, and that in the writing I would experience something of a rebirth. That's what it was for me to finally tell my story, first to myself, and now here to you, the reader. I'm fortunate. Few people can afford to review a whole life and find an outlet for their endeavor. I've long had a feeling, right or wrong, that I have a unique responsibility to share my experience of the pre-Apple Steve Jobs and to add my perspective to the record. Little is known about Steve as a teenager and young adult, but I knew the young man who was funny and thoughtful, the intellectually honest one who was searching for his place in the world and for what he believed was his big destiny. And I saw firsthand how he changed and changed and changed again as he learned to make use of and misuse power. As such, I believe that I have something to say about Steve. Also, I believe that my reflections as a young woman dealing with systems of power are valuable too. I suspect that many people will recognize their own stories in some of the details of this book. This and more kept me going, purposeful and inspired. In the end, what I have written is my story. This is not a tell-all or an exposé, nor is it journalism. This is my own narrative, and like all personal narratives, it takes its shape from experience, memory, and insight. I have tried to paint a thoughtful portrait of Steve, of myself, of the time, and of our relationship, and to gain an awareness of things that neither Steve nor I understood when they were happening. I can say for sure that were it not for the computer, I would never have been able to write this story. But if it weren't for the computer, I may not have needed to. Such are the simple ironies that have kept me amused throughout the past 7 years. And yes, I did write this on a Mac. 1. Creatives. I first noticed him in early January of my junior year of high school. It was 1972. He wore thin blue jeans that were full of big holes, the torn material hanging in loops around his legs. He was dressed in a nice pressed shirt and tennis shoes, and walked then, as he did as an adult, in a forward-falling gait, arms swinging with a contained reserve in his hands. It was a sunny California afternoon in early spring, and he was standing in the quad with a small book in his hand. I don't know why I hadn't seen him before, since, as I would find out later, many of my friends knew him. I was drawn to him immediately, and when he walked off campus, I followed him, wanting to say something but having no idea what or how. I surprised myself, because I ended up following him out to the edge of the campus 3 times over the next week. I finally gave up because it was too big a leap for me to introduce myself out of the blue to a boy I thought was cute. I never even learned his name. A month later, my friend and classmate, Mark Izu, started a film project and invited me to do the animation for it. Mark wanted to make a film, combining 2D animation, claymation, and actors, about how the students at our high school were struggling against forces that we believed wanted to stamp out our individuality. Mark's parents had been interned in a concentration camp for Japanese in the United States during World War II. And even though he didn't know this at the time we were making the movie, he was deeply motivated to speak about what it was to be made invisible. We all had our stories. In the course of the project, many people would be invited to contribute. But in the beginning, it was just the 3 of us: Mark, myself, and a guy named Steve Eckstein, the cameraman. We worked on the film at least one Friday or Saturday night a week for about 3 months, starting at 11 p.m. and going until dawn. Mark called the film Hampstead, a nod to the name of our school, Homestead High School. It was also the name of the stumpy little clay character he made to represent the everyman in the film. Our stage was a raised cement section in the central quad on campus, where I usually sat and ate my lunch during the school day. But this was night, and we were there without permission, risking God knows what if we were caught. The nights were cold. I was awed by the stars, and I loved that we were out there on our own, making something happen. Our tiny sounds were lost in the expanse of the cavernous cinder-block campus, and it felt like joy to be so focused and quiet, creating something from the margins with that sense of just we few. We worked continuously, Mark and Eckstein behind the camera, exchanging quiet words as they filmed, me under a single brilliant low-angled spotlight. From a semi-prone position, I drew my designs frame by frame, careful not to draw too little or too much before getting up and stepping back to pause for the frame to be shot, and then returning. This would go on for hours. On one night, Mark instructed me to build his clay man out of the ground piece by piece, so that it looked like Hampstead was emerging from the cement. He then handed me a second Hampstead that he had cut in half, from which I was to start the emergent scene. Once the little guy was fully out of the cement, I made his arms flail in painful insanity from having been buried alive. Another evening I was to draw a pathway for the little figure to walk down. Using cheap-colored chalk, I started by illustrating a soft morphing pattern that enfolded a mutated shape like a flickering fire. It looked psychedelic, but in truth, it was drawn from the memory of my parents' curling cigarette smoke, which I had loved watching as a child in Ohio, just tall enough for my eyes to follow during their monthly poker games with my grandparents. These were wonderful nights on the Homestead campus, and they created a sense of independence and spaciousness in me. If the film was about losing our authenticity, then making it was the antidote. Over time, word got out and people started showing up in 2s and 3s to see what we were doing. Musicians, cartoonists, late-night stoners, and others joined in. The creatives who represented the gifted and curious Homestead student body. I would look up from my work to see a surprising riot of quiet activity as more and more familiar faces appeared. There was some kind of rare nutrient happiness in all this, and I felt my life filling in around me. By the time the lavender dawn came to end the night, I went home spent, profoundly grateful, and achingly relieved that once again we had not been caught trespassing. It was maybe a little more than a month into the project when Steve emerged through the darkness and walked straight over to me. I wondered if he'd known that I was interested in him, because his path to me was so unerringly direct. But I had told no one. He was tall and beautiful and intentional, a study in contrasts, something like a fine prince in shabby jeans, a little awkward and vulnerable, but courageous too. Behind the small talk, we sought out a connection. Then he reached into his pocket and gave me a copy of Bob Dylan's song, Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands. I could feel the indent of the letters as I opened the paper, and I wondered if it was typed for me or if he just happened to have it on him and wanted to share it. I never asked. Later, I would come to understand that there was a kind of morphic field around Steve. Things happened. They were uncanny. Not particularly planned, but perfect. We talked for about 20 minutes, long enough for me to observe every minuscule detail about him. The power of his intense eyes and his young sensitivity. The sense that he was just passing through. At the end of our conversation, I saw him retreat back into himself. And then, with an inexplicably harsh scan of me and the quad, a look that seemed to come from nowhere, he disappeared back into the night. Over the months of working on the film, I had plenty of downtime. I found it hard to wait around when I wasn't useful to a scene. So I filled my time by painting a picture copied from the photography book put together by Edward Steichen, called The Family of Man. This book, which I had furtively removed from my mother's bookshelves, was dated and signed by an old boyfriend of hers who had apparently given it to her as a gift. I looked at this book often, and had considered the signature as the limited window into my mother's world before me. It was all so frustrating. Who was this man? Did he and my mother love each other? Many times my mother had told us that she hoped my sisters and I would be undressed by a poet once in our lives. Was he her poet? And why, for God's sake, only once? The Family of Man is a beautifully conceived book with images from hundreds of contributing photographers from all over the world. It's a treasure that captures the breadth of shared human experience, not just in the photographs, but in the very poetry of the captions. The world of man dances in laughter and tears. Kabir. Clasp hands and know the thoughts of men from other lands. John Masefield. Eat bread and salt and speak the truth. Old Russian proverb. If I did not work, these worlds would perish. Bhagavad Gita. With all beings and all things, we shall be as relatives. Sioux Indian. I pored over this book so many times that it taught me to love the world, to love life, and know myself by way of word and image. I had both drawn and painted from it. And this time I wanted to paint a photograph taken by Homer Page of a South African black man who had been captured, with the camera looking directly into his powerful, searching face. The one line under his image is, "Who is on my side? Who?" The book has imprinted my life so profoundly I feel my cells could give an account of it. I had always liked this photograph. It spoke to me. My great-uncle was Branch Rickey, the man who had the heart and the vision, the power and position to bring Jackie Robinson into the major leagues. They were both heroes of mine, and I was proud to be associated with that history. These men embodied the kind of aspirations I had for myself, to be a leader and do something for others, to make a difference. So this painting was, for me, a form of guerrilla art. I cared about getting it right, and I cared about making a statement from the margins. I worked in oils and painted directly on cement at the edge of the quad, in a relatively dark location near the filming. Steve must have seen me working on the painting because he appeared one night happily fumbling with a candle and some matches so that I could see better. That spring, As the film progressed and I painted, Steve would show up to sit next to me while I worked. I was always unspeakably thrilled to see him, and yet I never could stand having someone hover while I worked. My painting was always deeply private, and I never painted when people were around. But because I had no idea how to ask him to leave, and because he sat so quietly, barely perched on the seat next to me as if in some kind of transcendent state, I let it be. I pushed the paint around, distracted and noncommittal, and saved the real painting for the nights he didn't come. In mid-April, more than a month after our first meeting, Steve and I excitedly decided to meet at his house so that we could spend some time together, just the two of us. He said his parents worked and that we would have the house to ourselves. I agreed that it would be nice to see each other alone in the daytime for once. Since he left school at 1 o'clock and I got out at 3:30, he drew me a map to his house on Christ Drive, 1.5 miles away. When I arrived at the Jobses' front door, Steve motioned to me from his bedroom window. "Come in." I remember being a little taken aback by his not coming to meet me at the front door. No grand gestures of chivalry on this day. My guess is that he was so nervous he had decided to play it cool. Maybe he had even staged the scene to look casual. I entered the house and turned the corner into his bedroom. Steve's room was small and almost barracks-like. Everything in it was plain and organized. He had a single bed, a dark-stained wooden bookcase, a chest of drawers, and a small desk under the window that looked out onto the front yard. I noticed a typewriter on his desk, a huge IBM Selectric in a bright shade of red. I was impressed that Steve owned such high-end technology. Etched in my memory from that time is the quality of his hands on that typewriter. He had beautiful, quiet, intelligent hands with long, elegant fingers. When he was typing, the machine would pound out individual letters with such shocking force and velocity that it belied the casual touch of his fingertips. Steve's hands were made for technology. There was a sublime compatibility with the machine in them, natural and unaffected from the beginning. Other than that typewriter, Steve's room was reminiscent of the boys' rooms I had played in as a child, especially the colors: dull beiges, browns, army greens, harsh, garish oranges and reds. I didn't like them, but the room felt good because it was bright with some ineffable sense of light and order. I could feel and smell the air of it in Steve's room and near him, and I liked this very much. Over a year later, he would show me the inside of his closet after he had apparently spent the day cleaning. It was a thing of beauty for its organization. The closet was small but deep, and everything was arranged for the best use of space. Steve's clothes were hung neatly, and his backpack, tent, and other camping equipment were looped over hooks in the back. His shoes were arranged on some floor shelving, his tapes were nicely boxed, and his books and other belongings were organized on the top shelf overhead. Sweeping his hand as if performing, he said, "Look at this." I had never seen him proud of cleaning. I didn't really care, but he was positively glowing. It's not too big a stretch to consider this the precursor to his sense for aesthetics, perhaps even his showman's flourish. Smiling, Steve told me he threw anything away if A, he wasn't using it, and B, it cost less than $25. $25 was his tipping point, apparently, and it wasn't worth taking up space if he could replace it for that amount or less. He had put real thought into this, weighing the relationship of money, organization, and serviceability, both present and future. It was like child's play showing the mind he would apply later to computer design. Steve was sitting on the floor when I walked in that first day. His knees were bent and he was leaning against his bed. He had super plush headphones over his ears that plugged into a 3-foot-high reel-to-reel tape player. We were both nervous, and he made gruff references to his collection of Bob Dylan bootlegs from this or that concert. The importance of all this was completely lost on me. I was clueless about bootlegs of anything, thinking bootlegging had something to do with alcohol during Prohibition, though I got the drift they were some kind of contraband. It was the beginning of my fragile girl window into his tender boy world. I don't recall the conversation that first spring afternoon. I just remembered that it was a little work to get beyond the awkwardness of a new friendship, to find out who the other was, who we were together, and how much might be possible. There was that excited feeling in the air. Since he had invited me there and I had accepted, I think both of us knew that doors were opening and love was coming. Mark's project was finishing by mid-May, and most everyone who had been a part of the weekly events came to celebrate. We threw a formal dinner party in the middle of the night in the central campus, the motherboard of our communal lives. Converging in the freedom of the night air one last time, we, a band of bright, happy creatures dressed in gowns and tuxedos, Steve had managed to score a top hat, toasted, ate, and laughed around a long, candlelit table in full Fellini-esque style. A quartet and a strobe light made us all feel as if we were in some elegant, silent film. During that spring, with the film and some Saturday afternoon baseball games as backdrop, Steve and I got to know each other better. He didn't talk a lot, but he was funny and vibrant and really good at making me laugh. But he was shy. So shy, in fact, that he couldn't give me our first kiss. I was so embarrassed by his trying that I finally kissed him. After we were together for a while, Steve ventured to tell me that I was his North Country girl, the one from the Dylan song who was a true love, the one he would know before fame and wealth came, the one hit by heavy winds. Even then he had placed me in his Life as Bob Dylan timeline. I didn't understand that I was somehow being set up to play a part in some mythic script he was designing for himself. I was a small-boned, petite girl, just 5'2". I had long, light brown hair turned gold on the outer layers by the sun. I have a high forehead and slightly elongated face, refined, expressive hands, and green eyes. I am dyslexic, which has had the effect of making me differently wired, creative, and a voracious problem solver. Bright, but more than slightly clueless to convention. I suppose Steve would have intuited that I had a perceptive mind with a sense-oriented awareness of the world around me. What did I see in Steve? I knew he was a genius when I first saw him because his eyes shone with brilliant, complicated cartwheels of light. In time, I came to understand how fully off-the-charts intuitive and mature beyond his years he was. Like an old soul with quiet knowledge. He had deep brown hair and marble-white skin that was super-sensitive and yet also thick, which I would later realize was not unlike his personality. He had a slight lisp, and his upper and lower teeth met perfectly, giving his Middle Eastern lips and nose an even more distinctive look. His smile had the glint of a pirate with treasure in the hull. There was a profound sadness about him that drew me in. But there was also an unspoken fullness in his stature that gave the impression he had the humility and strength to walk through the world as he truly was. I admired this right from the start. I know humility might sound unlikely to some, but it's like the salt in chocolate, the small, contrasting flavor that makes you know that the strength is real and true. The mix of all this came to life in a personality that was irreverent, bright, offbeat, awkward, funny, and full of mystery. I adored him beyond everything, pure and simple. We were different from each other in many ways. I was sense and soul-oriented, and he was logical and intuitive. Yet we shared basic creative values and were both fiercely experimental. Steve and I wanted to find the pathways through any and all limitations, and that impulse was stronger than the fear of making mistakes. Neither of us placed great importance on the need to be right. The notion that we were a true yin and yang still resonates for me, even though in time the same quality would become polarized, destructive even. In those days, I considered Steve a guide for me because I saw an intellectual honesty in him. He was tall and had the sophisticated, unadorned presence I imagined Abraham Lincoln to have had. Self-effacing and honest. Funny. Nothing extra. I was dealing with the corrosive home life, which was shattering my ability to build the next stages of my life. But Steve was further along in thinking about the shape of his adulthood and the road that would take him there. He had an aerial view of things, and I could see he was cataloging information that implied scope and goal. He spoke in cloaked metaphors and had a big conversation going on inside. I wanted to know more about that conversation. I needed to know more, and found myself quick to pay attention to his young stores of knowledge to get the sense of how he saw things. I believed that he was equally delighted and interested to see the world through my impulses, perceptions, and creativity. Steve would play with words that were quirky and obscure to me, often saying that he was the imposter, or mysteriously repeating that something was going to last for 40 days and 40 nights, or that it was 39 past the hour. Then there were the numerous rounds of "the fool is the highest card," a reference that indicated an archetype and more. Because the fool, marked by the 0 in the tarot, is about nothing and everything. It's all about potential. Placing himself in this starring role and winking at me with a shiny smile, Steve was the fool, the one who would walk over the edge of the known world and willy-nilly take the consequences. Oh yes, he was the courageous fool who knew from a very early age that he had something to do in the world. But this all contrasted with the darker warning he would give, that he was a no-good boyo, from Dylan Thomas's Under Milkwood, which I wondered at each time he said it. Finally, there was the "I'm living on borrowed time" refrain. I never knew what he was talking about, but I would tilt my head to listen as if from an inner ear, searching for clues in the mix of it all. We had both been hit by the winds of the 60s and had developed a core distrust of convention and an unbounded excitement for the amazing possibilities that lay ahead. Whatever we were to become, we shared this teenage stage of hunting and gathering that would keep us delighted and unfolding. From this shared ground and atmosphere, we were willing, indeed bursting, to be experimental. We might have been called visionaries, except back then I never would have connected this word to the urgent need to expand beyond the known. It was just what was. 2. An absolute authority. For the first 6 weeks of our friendship, Steve and I existed almost exclusively in our teenage world. High school, the nighttime movie set, baseball games on the Cupertino Middle School lawn. But it would be some time before we would meet each other's parents. It was a late Saturday morning when I first met Paul and Clara Jobs. They were painting his sister Patty's bedroom, and in the background hum of introductions, I noticed the most beautiful yellow I had ever seen. The tone caught me off guard and made me wonder who these people were to have chosen it. My mind raced. No one in all of my extended family had ever used such a color, or even come close. Its soft warmth aroused in me a spirit of awe. Harder to understand were the other feelings it provoked. A sense of having missed something, of disappointment in my own family. But I soon understood that this yellow was an exception. Everything else in the Jobs' house was predictable and austere. The beige couch, the big brown lazy-boy and ottoman, the blonde wood dining and coffee tables. A large TV took center stage in the living room, and above it a bookshelf that displayed the family's entire collection of about 15 books, including the Book of Job, along with school photographs of Steve and his sister Patty. Steve's photograph showed a chubby 5th grader with that one eye half closed, and whose beautiful face was mischievous and sweet, but inscrutable nonetheless. The Jobs' home had economy-sized bags of candy lying around the living room and grocery store jelly rolls in their 40s-style kitchen. They had a big boat in the driveway. Steve and Patty water-skied, and a pet rabbit that roamed freely around the house and backyard, which surprised me to no end. I mean, no end. And when I glanced into the master bedroom, I saw twin beds. Steve's parents slept separately, like a 1950s TV couple. There was no romance here. This was a home filled with things well considered for practicality, a home without nuanced beauty. It was the kind of place I imagined would have belonged to someone's grandparents. Paul Jobs was a thin man, just shy of 6 feet tall. He had a military haircut, which was a little unusual in those days, even on fathers, when sideburns were the norm. He had elongated lines in his pinched cheeks and watery gray eyes.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?